The rain in the city that autumn was the kind that never fully committed to falling. A thin gray mist that clung to windshields and street lamps and made every morning feel like the edge of something colder still to come. Maya Brooks pedaled her second-hand electric bicycle through those mornings with a canvas bag of bread strapped across her back, her breath fogging in front of her, her gloves worn thin at the fingertips. She was 27 years old and had been delivering bread for a small bakery called Union Loaf for almost 3 years, weaving through traffic on streets that never seemed to notice her, past glass towers that reflected a sky she rarely had time to look up at. She did not complain. She had learned long ago that complaining did not put food on a table or gas in a tank, and so she simply moved forward, one delivery at a time, one tip jar at a time, one small kindness at a time, because kindness, unlike money, was something she always had enough of to give away. Her customers were mostly wealthy, tucked behind doormen and keypads, ordering sourdough and rye for breakfasts they would barely touch. Some tipped generously without looking at her twice. Others did not tip at all, and some did not even open the door themselves, leaving instructions for a package to be left with a concierge who treated Maya like she was invisible, a uniform rather than a person. She had grown used to being looked past. It did not harden her the way it might have hardened someone else. If anything, it made her more careful to notice the people that the rest of the city refused to see, because she understood, in a way that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition, what it felt like to be unseen. It was on one of those gray mornings, 3 weeks before everything in her life would change, that she first noticed the old man sitting near the boarded entrance of the abandoned train station on 9th Street. He was not asking for money. He was not holding a sign or a cup or anything at all except a Bible so worn that its cover had softened into something closer to cloth than leather. He sat with his back straight against the brick wall, his coat too thin for the weather, his hands folded over the book in his lap, as though he were waiting for a train that had stopped running decades ago. Maya slowed her bicycle without quite deciding to, watching him from across the street, and something in the stillness of him made her chest tighten in a way she did not have words for yet. She thought about riding past. She had a schedule, a route, a manager who counted minutes the way other people counted money. But she also had $11 in her pocket that was meant to be her lunch, and she found herself crossing the street before she had finished making the decision, walking into the small coffee shop on the corner and coming back out with a warm loaf of bread and a paper cup that steamed faintly in the cold air. She knelt beside the old man and held them out without ceremony, the way she might have handed something to a neighbor, and he looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too clear and far too knowing for a man the city had clearly forgotten. He did not thank her right away. He simply studied her face for a long moment, as though he were trying to memorize it, as though her features held some answer he had been waiting a long time to find. Then he took the bread with both hands, cradling it the way one might cradle something fragile, and he said, in a voice that was rough but unhurried, that she should never let this city take her heart from her, because a heart like hers was rarer than anything money could buy. Maya laughed softly, embarrassed by the weight of the compliment, and told him it was just a loaf of bread. He shook his head slowly and told her that one day, this very kindness would come back to change her life in ways she could not yet imagine. She smiled, thinking it was simply the kind of thing lonely old men said to strangers who showed them a moment of warmth, and she climbed back onto her bicycle and rode away, already thinking about the next delivery, already forgetting, or believing she had forgotten, the strange certainty in his voice. She did not forget him. Not really. Over the following days, she found herself glancing toward the train station out of habit, and more often than not he was there, upright against the same wall, reading the same soft Bible, as though it contained an entire library within its pages. She began stopping by 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with bread, sometimes with nothing more than a few minutes of conversation, and she noticed that he never once asked her for anything. He asked instead about her day, about the weight of her deliveries, about whether her knees ached from the cold the way his did, and there was something almost fatherly in the attention, something that made the empty space in her chest where her own father used to be feel, just briefly, a little less empty. His name, he told her one gray afternoon, was Samuel. He offered no last name, and she did not press for one, sensing without being told that there were doors in this man's history that he did not open for anyone. What she noticed instead was how much he seemed to know about things that had nothing to do with a man who slept outside a train station. When she mentioned, half joking, that Union Loaf was struggling to keep up with a new bakery chain that had opened 2 streets over, Samuel asked her 3 quiet questions about pricing and loyalty, and the difference between a customer and a regular. And by the time he finished speaking, she realized he had, without raising his voice or his hands, diagnosed exactly what her manager had been doing wrong for months. She asked him where he had learned to think that way. He only smiled and said that he had spent a lifetime around numbers, before he had spent a lifetime around silence. And when she tried to ask what that meant, his gaze drifted toward the skyline behind her, toward the tall glass tower that bore a name she had delivered bread beneath dozens of times without ever looking up at it. The Carter Foods building rose above the rest of the block like something carved rather than built, all steel and glass and quiet, expensive light. She had noticed Samuel looking at it before, but this time the look lasted longer, and something in his face folded inward, an old grief passing over features that had otherwise learned to stay calm. She almost asked him about it. She almost said his name, the way one might reach towards someone standing too close to an edge. But he closed the subject the way he always did, gently, without unkindness, simply turning the conversation back toward her mother's health, toward the ache in her shoulders from carrying too many loaves. Maya let it go, though she carried the image of his face home with her that night, unable to shake the feeling that there was an entire life folded up inside this quiet, gentle stranger, a life he had chosen, for reasons she could not guess, to leave behind entirely. Across the city, in an office on the top floor of that same glass tower, Ethan Carter stood at a window overlooking streets he rarely walked anymore. Streets that had become abstractions to him, numbers on a map rather than places where people like Maya rode bicycles through the rain. He was 36 years old and had run Carter Foods for nearly 8 of those years, having inherited both the company and its considerable weight the moment his father disappeared without explanation more than 2 decades earlier. He was, by every external measure, a success. He built the company into something larger and more powerful than his father had ever imagined, expanding it across 3 states, doubling its workforce, turning a modest regional grocery supplier into a name recognized in boardrooms far beyond his own city. He did all of this with a discipline that bordered on ferocity. And somewhere along the way, the discipline had hardened into something colder, a wall he had built so carefully around himself that even he sometimes forgot it was there. He did not talk about his father. He had trained himself, over 20 years, to change the subject the instant anyone brought up the name Samuel Carter, to redirect conversations toward quarterly earnings, or supply chain logistics, or anything at all that kept him from having to sit with the old wound that never quite closed. Victoria Lane, his vice president, and the person who had stood beside him since the earliest days of his rise, understood this about him better than anyone, and she used that understanding the way a skilled surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, without hesitation, always for what she insisted were his own good. Whenever a journalist asked about his family, whenever an old employee mentioned a memory of his father, Victoria was there within moments, smooth and composed, steering him back toward safer ground, reminding him in her calm, practiced voice that the past could only ever make him weaker, that a man who wanted to lead could not afford the luxury of looking backward. Ethan believed her, or told himself he did, because the alternative was reopening a door he had spent 20 years bricking shut. He believed his father had chosen money over family, had vanished the way certain men vanish when the truth of their choices becomes too heavy to carry. And he built his entire identity in opposition to that abandonment, determined to never again be the kind of man who left people behind. It was perhaps the deepest irony of his life that in trying so hard not to become his father, he had become someone almost impossible to reach, a man who kept everyone, even those closest to him, at a careful, guarded distance. It was into this life, without either of them knowing it, that a bread delivery from a small bakery called Union Loaf was about to arrive. The order came in on an ordinary Tuesday, a request from the executive floor for pastries to be delivered ahead of a board meeting, and Maya's manager, thrilled at the prospect of a contract with a company as large as Carter Foods, insisted that she personally handle the delivery to make the best possible impression. Maya arrived at the tower with her bicycle locked outside and a box balanced carefully against her hip, and she felt, the moment she stepped through the revolving doors, the particular chill of a place built to remind visitors of their smallness. The security guard at the front desk looked her up and down, with the practiced disinterest of a man who had long ago decided which visitors deserved his attention and which did not, and he waved her toward a service elevator, without bothering to look at her twice. She rode up in silence, the box warm against her side, and when the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, she found herself in a hallway so quiet it seemed to absorb sound. All pale wood and frosted glass, employees moving briskly past her without a glance in her direction. She delivered the pastries to a receptionist who thanked her with the same detached courtesy the guard downstairs had shown. And as she turned to leave, she caught, for the briefest of moments, the reflection of a man standing near a corner office, tall and composed in a dark suit, his attention fixed on something in his hand. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds, no more, an accidental crossing of two strangers' gazes in a hallway neither of them would remember by the end of the day, or so it seemed. Neither said a word. Maya turned and walked back toward the elevator, and Ethan Carter returned his attention to his phone, filing the encounter away in the part of his mind reserved for things too small to matter. What neither of them knew, what neither of them could have known, was that far below the tower's polished lobby, Samuel Carter stood across the street in the cold, watching the building he had once helped design the very foundations of, watching the doors his son now walked through every single day, without ever knowing his father was close enough to see him. He had followed Maya there, without telling her, curious in a way he could not quite name, and when he saw her disappear through the revolving doors, something in his chest constricted so tightly that he had to lean against a lamppost to steady himself. He stood there for a long time after she left, his eyes fixed on the top floors of the tower, and those who passed him on the sidewalk saw only an old homeless man, staring up at nothing, never guessing that somewhere behind that glass, his own son was building an empire on the foundation of a grief he did not know he was standing on. Tears came to Samuel that afternoon, quiet and unhurried, the kind of tears that arrive after decades of practice at holding them back. He did not wipe them away quickly. He simply let them fall, watching the building, watching the doors, until the cold finally drove him back toward the train station and the small, worn corner that had become, in the strangest way, something like a home. He told no one what he had seen or felt. He carried it, as he had carried everything else for 20 years, silently, believing that his silence was a kind of protection, a gift he was still giving to a son who had long ago stopped believing he deserved anything from his father at all. It was not long after that Maya began to notice something wrong. She came by the train station on a Thursday, with a warm roll wrapped in paper, expecting to find Samuel in his usual spot, and found instead only the cold brick wall and a scattering of pigeons picking at nothing. She told herself he had simply moved on for the day, perhaps to find shelter from the wind. But when she returned the next morning and the morning after that, and still found no trace of him, worry began to settle into her chest like a stone. She asked around the neighborhood, describing the old man with the soft Bible and the gentle voice, and a shopkeeper 2 blocks down finally told her that an ambulance had come for someone matching that description 3 days earlier, someone who had collapsed on the sidewalk from what witnesses guessed was exhaustion or cold or both. Maya did not think twice. She left her bicycle locked outside the bakery, ignored her manager's protests about missed deliveries, and made her way to the nearest hospital, moving through the sterile white hallways with a mounting panic she could not fully explain, given that she had known this man for only a matter of weeks. And yet something about him had settled into her the way certain people do, quietly, without asking permission, until his absence felt like a hole where warmth used to be. She found him eventually in a small shared room on the 3rd floor, thinner than she remembered, an oxygen tube resting beneath his nose, his eyes closed but his breathing steady. She sat beside his bed for a long while before he stirred, and when he finally opened his eyes and saw her there, something in his face broke open, with a relief so raw it startled her. It was while the nurse checked his vitals that Maya noticed the small plastic bag of his personal belongings resting on the bedside table, and inside it, half hidden beneath a folded coat, she saw the glint of an old pocket watch, its surface scratched and worn, but its engraving still legible, in careful, looping script. The single word etched into its casing was Carter. Maya stared at it for a long moment, her mind refusing at first to connect the dots that were arranging themselves in front of her, and when she looked back up at Samuel, she saw in his expression the unmistakable weight of a man who knew exactly what she had just seen and had no strength left to hide it any longer. The hospital staff, following standard procedure, asked Samuel repeatedly for the name of a family member to contact, and each time he refused, insisting quietly that there was no one to call, that he had no family left in this world worth disturbing. Maya watched this happen twice, and both times she felt something twist uncomfortably in her stomach, because she had begun to suspect, with a certainty that frightened her, that the man in front of her was not simply refusing out of pride, but was actively protecting someone from a truth he had spent 20 years keeping buried. She did not confront him about the watch that day. She simply sat with him, held his hand when the machines beeped too loudly, and promised herself that whatever secret he was carrying, she would give him the space to reveal it in his own time, on his own terms, the way he had always given her that same respect. It was 2 days later, while Maya sat reading beside his bed, that an elderly lawyer in a gray overcoat appeared at the door, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who had rehearsed this visit many times in his mind. He introduced himself simply as an old friend checking in on a client, and when he addressed the man in the bed, he did not call him Samuel. He called him Mr. Carter, with a formality that made the air in the room shift instantly, and Maya felt her pulse quicken, as every small, unexplained detail of the past few weeks began arranging itself into a single, devastating shape. She looked at Samuel, searching his face for denial, for some explanation that would make the lawyer's words mean something other than what they so obviously meant. But Samuel only closed his eyes and nodded once, as though giving permission for a truth to finally step out of hiding. The lawyer, once he realized Maya already suspected the truth, spoke plainly, choosing his words with the careful economy of someone who had waited a long time to say them aloud. Samuel Carter, he explained, had once been a co-founder of Carter Foods, standing beside his young son in the earliest days of building what would become one of the largest food companies in the region. He had walked away from all of it more than 20 years earlier, disappearing so completely that even his closest associates had assumed, over time, that he had died somewhere quiet and unremarkable. Maya sat frozen through the entire explanation, her mind reaching backward through every conversation she had shared with this gentle old man, searching for the moment she should have guessed, and finding instead only the quiet dignity of someone who had carried an unbearable weight without ever once complaining about its size. When the lawyer finally left, Samuel reached for Maya's hand with a strength that surprised her, and he asked her, his voice thin but steady, to keep what she had learned to herself. He explained that his son, whom he called only by his first name at first, deserved a life untouched by the chaos of a past he did not fully understand, and that reopening old wounds now, after so many years, would only cause pain without offering any real healing in return. Maya wanted to argue. Every instinct in her told her that secrets like this one rarely stayed buried forever, and that the longer they remained hidden, the more damage they tended to do when they finally surfaced. But she saw the fear in Samuel's eyes, a fear that had nothing to do with himself and everything to do with protecting a son he clearly still loved, from a distance he had chosen, but never stopped regretting, and so, against her better judgment, she agreed to keep his secret. What neither of them yet understood was that Samuel's secret had already reached other ears within the walls of Carter Foods, carried there by a woman who had spent 20 years making absolutely certain it never resurfaced. Victoria Lane had learned, through a contact who monitored the company's legal filings, that a man named Samuel Carter had been admitted to a public hospital under his own name, and the moment she confirmed his identity, a cold and familiar dread settled into her chest. She had built her entire career, her entire relationship with Ethan, on the foundation of a story she herself had helped construct 2 decades earlier, and the return of the real Samuel threatened to dismantle every careful brick of that foundation in a single conversation. It had been Victoria, back when she was still a young and ambitious junior executive, who discovered that Samuel intended to expose certain financial irregularities within the company's early expansion, irregularities that would have implicated several board members, including a man who later became her most valuable ally in her own rise through the company. Rather than allow the truth to surface, Victoria had helped fabricate a narrative in which Samuel abandoned his family for reasons of greed and cowardice, forging documents and shaping whispers until the story hardened into something everyone, including his own son, simply accepted as fact. Samuel, faced with the choice of exposing corruption at the cost of his son's inheritance and reputation, or disappearing quietly and letting the lie stand, had chosen the second path, believing it was the only way to protect Ethan from a scandal that would have destroyed everything he was building. He had paid for that choice with 2 decades of silence, watching his son grow into a powerful but wounded man from a distance he was never permitted to close. Victoria understood, the moment she learned Samuel was alive and speaking again, that her carefully constructed version of history could collapse in an instant if he ever told Ethan the truth. She moved quickly and quietly, reaching out through intermediaries to a private security contact she had used before, instructing them to find a way to convince Samuel that leaving the city again, permanently, and without further contact, was in everyone's best interest. Maya, still visiting Samuel daily at the hospital, and later at the small transitional shelter he was moved to for recovery, noticed the sudden appearance of unfamiliar men lingering near the entrance, watching a little too carefully, asking questions of the staff that had nothing to do with genuine concern. Her instincts, sharpened by years of reading the city's streets for danger, told her immediately that something was wrong. It was the first time in her life Maya had ever stood directly in the path of real power and refused to move. When one of Victoria's men approached her outside the shelter, offering a folded sum of money in exchange for her silence and her distance from Samuel, Maya looked at the cash in his hand and felt something in her harden into resolve rather than fear. She told him, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she had no intention of taking money to abandon a friend, and that whoever had sent him should understand that some things were not for sale. The man left without further argument, clearly unprepared for a woman with so little to lose to have so much conviction, and Maya spent the walk home that night trembling, not from fear, but from the strange, unfamiliar power of having stood her ground against something far larger than herself. Samuel, once he recovered enough strength to sit up and speak clearly for long stretches at a time, made a decision that had been circling him for 20 years, like a slow tide, finally reaching the shore. He asked Maya, gently but firmly, to help him arrange a meeting with his son, explaining that he was tired, in every sense of the word, of protecting Ethan with silence, when perhaps what his son needed most was simply the truth. Maya hesitated, uncertain whether she had any right to be involved in something so deeply personal to a family she had only recently stumbled into. But Samuel took her hand and told her that she was the reason he had found the courage to consider this at all, that her small, unasked for kindness on a cold morning had reminded him what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a mistake to be managed. Arranging the meeting proved more difficult than either of them expected, given how carefully Ethan's schedule was guarded and how quickly Victoria intervened whenever she sensed an opportunity for Samuel to reach him directly. It was ultimately Maya who found the opening, delivering one final order of bread to the Carter Foods building and asking, with a calm she did not entirely feel, whether she might speak with Mr. Carter directly regarding a personal matter. The receptionist, unaccustomed to such a request and unsure how to categorize it, escalated the message further than intended, and by the time Ethan heard that a delivery driver was asking to see him about something urgent, involving his family, curiosity, or perhaps some quieter instinct he did not yet understand, brought him down to the lobby himself. He recognized her immediately as the woman from the hallway weeks earlier, and something about her expression, so serious and so uncharacteristically nervous for someone who had always seemed calm in his brief memory of her, made him agree to hear her out in private. Maya, standing in a small glass conference room across from a man whose entire public persona radiated distance, found herself struggling for the right words, aware that whatever she said next would either open a door that had been sealed for 20 years or close it forever. She told him, as gently and as simply as she could, that his father was alive, that he had been living on the streets not far from this very building, and that he wanted, more than anything, the chance to speak with his son one final time. Ethan's reaction was not what Maya expected. There was no immediate softening, no rush of relief or joy. Instead, his face went pale and then hardened into something colder than she had yet seen, and he told her, in a voice tight with restrained fury, that his father had made his choice 2 decades earlier, when he walked out on a wife dying of grief and a son too young to understand why. He accused Maya, not unkindly but firmly, of being caught up in some kind of manipulation, perhaps even a scheme designed to extract money or sympathy from a company that had spent years fending off exactly these kinds of approaches. Maya did not argue with him. She simply placed on the table between them a single detail Samuel had asked her to share, only if words alone failed to convince him, a small brass key that Samuel said would unlock a drawer in the study of the childhood home. Ethan had long since sold, a drawer that, if it still existed at all, contained something Ethan needed to see with his own eyes. That single detail, so specific and so impossible for a stranger to have invented, was enough to crack the wall Ethan had spent 20 years building. He agreed, against every instinct of caution his years in business had taught him, to meet the man Maya described. Though he insisted the meeting take place somewhere neutral, somewhere he could walk away from easily, if it turned out to be exactly the kind of deception he feared. Samuel, when the day finally arrived, chose instead to meet his son, not in some carefully arranged, neutral space, but at the shelter where he had been recovering, seated in a plain chair beside a window, wearing the same thin coat he had worn the day Maya first gave him bread, because he wanted his son to see him exactly as he was, without pretense, without the trappings of the life he had once had. Ethan walked into that small room, prepared for anger, prepared for accusations, prepared for almost anything except the sight of his father, older and thinner and more fragile than the image he had carried in his memory for 20 years, sitting quietly with tears already gathering in his eyes before either of them had spoken a single word. For a long moment neither man moved. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, every carefully constructed wall inside him straining under the sudden, overwhelming presence of a grief he had never allowed himself to fully feel, and Samuel simply looked at his son, drinking in the sight of him the way a man drinks water after years in a desert. It was Samuel who finally broke the silence, his voice trembling as he reached beneath his chair and produced a worn leather satchel he had kept close through every shelter and every cold night for 20 years. Inside it, wrapped carefully in cloth to protect them from the elements, were dozens of letters, each one addressed to Ethan, each one dated across 2 decades of birthdays and holidays and milestones. His father had watched slip by from a distance he was never permitted to close. He explained, his voice breaking with every sentence, that he had written to his son every single year, unable to send the letters for fear that any contact would expose Ethan to the very scandal he had sacrificed everything to prevent, and that keeping them, holding on to them, had been the only way he knew to stay connected to a boy who had long since grown into a man he had never truly gotten to know. Ethan took the satchel with hands that were no longer entirely steady, and he sat down slowly across from his father, opening the first letter with a care that betrayed just how much composure it was costing him to remain upright. The letter was dated from the year after Samuel disappeared, and in it, in handwriting that trembled with restrained emotion, Samuel had written about watching Ethan from a distance at his high school graduation, standing at the edge of the crowd where his son would never see him, so proud he could barely breathe, so ashamed of the choice he had made that he could not bring himself to approach. Ethan read on, letter after letter, watching 2 decades of his own life, reflected back at him through the eyes of a father he had believed did not care. A father who had, in fact, never once stopped watching, never once stopped loving him, from whatever careful distance circumstance and sacrifice had forced between them. By the time Ethan reached the final letter, dated only weeks earlier, his composure had fully given way, tears falling freely down a face that rarely allowed itself such vulnerability, and he looked up at his father with an expression that held 20 years of anger dissolving, slowly and painfully, into something closer to understanding. Samuel reached across the small space between them and rested a trembling hand on his son's shoulder, and Ethan, after a lifetime of building walls precisely to avoid moments like this one, finally let himself be held, folding into his father's arms the way he had not done since he was a small boy, both men weeping openly, in a way neither had permitted themselves in 20 long years. When Ethan finally learned the full truth, not just of his father's disappearance, but of the fabricated story that had painted Samuel as a man who abandoned his family for money, his grief curdled quickly into a fury, directed not at his father, but at the woman who had shaped his understanding of that grief for 2 decades. Victoria Lane had known him since he was a young executive stepping tentatively into his father's shoes, had guided him, mentored him, stood beside him through every major decision of his career, and the revelation that she had also engineered the central wound of his life left him staggered in a way even the return of his father had not quite managed. He confronted her directly, in the same glass conference room where Maya had first told him the truth, laying the forged documents and the letters side by side on the table between them, watching her carefully composed expression crack for the first time in the 8 years he had known her. Victoria did not deny it, not fully, though she tried at first to frame her actions as protection rather than betrayal, insisting that everything she had done to shield Ethan and the company from a scandal that would have destroyed both. Ethan listened to her explanation with a stillness that unsettled her far more than shouting would have, and when she finished speaking, he told her, in a voice quiet with finality, that the difference between protection and manipulation was that protection did not require 20 years of lies fed to a grieving child. Her position at Carter Foods ended that same week, quietly at first, and then, as the details inevitably surfaced among board members and longtime employees, very publicly, her name becoming a cautionary tale within the very halls she had once ruled with such careful control. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself returning again and again to Maya, first out of gratitude, and then, gradually, out of something he had not expected to feel at all. He sought her out at the bakery, insisting on personally thanking her for the courage it had taken to defy Victoria's men, and for the persistence it had taken to bring his father back into his life. And Maya, uncomfortable with the attention, tried repeatedly to deflect his gratitude, insisting that she had done nothing more than any decent person would have done for another human being left out in the cold. Ethan disagreed, gently but firmly, pointing out that decency, real decency, without any expectation of reward, was rarer in his experience than almost anything else in the world, and that watching her refuse every offer of compensation, every bonus, every reward his company tried to press upon her, had taught him more about integrity than anything he had learned in 8 years of running a corporation. Their conversations, at first formal and stilted, softened over weeks into something easier, something neither of them had quite expected to find. Ethan found himself drawn not to the polish and performance he encountered constantly in his professional life, but to the plain, unhurried honesty Maya brought to every exchange, her willingness to challenge him gently when his old instincts toward coldness resurfaced, her refusal to be impressed by wealth she had spent her entire life without. Maya, for her part, found in Ethan someone far different from the distant executive she had glimpsed that first day in the hallway, discovering beneath the careful armor a man capable of real tenderness, a man who had simply forgotten, somewhere along the way, that tenderness was allowed. Samuel watched this quiet unfolding with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 20 years believing he would never again witness his son's happiness up close. He often sat with Maya in the small garden behind the shelter where he continued to stay even after Ethan offered him a home, insisting that he was not yet ready to leave behind the community that had sheltered him through his hardest years, and he would tell her, with the wry, gentle humor that had first drawn her to him, that she had chosen exactly the right moment to buy an old man a loaf of bread. Maya would laugh and remind him that she had not chosen anything, that it had simply felt like the right thing to do at the time, and Samuel would shake his head and tell her that the right things, done without calculation, were exactly the things that ended up changing the world in ways no one could have planned. The full truth of Victoria's manipulation eventually became public knowledge, not through any deliberate campaign, but through the slow, inevitable process by which secrets, once loosened, tend to unravel entirely. Employees who had long sensed something unspoken beneath the company's official history began speaking more openly. Journalists who had once been steered carefully away from the Carter family's past found doors suddenly open to them. And what emerged was not a story of scandal so much as a story of resilience, of a father who sacrificed everything to protect his son, and a son who, once given the truth, chose forgiveness over the bitterness that had defined so much of his adult life. Carter Foods, rather than suffering under the weight of this revelation, found itself embraced by a public hungry for exactly this kind of story, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions were, at their core, built by ordinary people carrying extraordinary burdens. Ethan used the company's renewed public attention to do something he had quietly wanted to do for years, but had never found the courage to propose, while Victoria's influence still shaped so much of his decision-making. He announced the creation of a citywide initiative aimed at supporting people experiencing homelessness, funding shelters, job training programs, and medical care across every neighborhood the company operated in, insisting that the initiative be named not after himself or his father, but simply the Bread and Table Fund, a nod to the small, unglamorous act of kindness that had brought his family back together. He asked Maya, whose instincts for genuine, unpretentious generosity he trusted more than any consultant the company could hire, to help design and oversee the program. And though she hesitated at first, unsure whether she belonged in a boardroom at all, Samuel encouraged her gently, telling her that the world needed people who understood kindness from the ground up, not just from behind a desk. Maya accepted the role eventually, though she insisted, against the advice of nearly everyone around her, on continuing her bread deliveries on weekends, unwilling to let a new title erase the habits that had shaped her into the person capable of doing this work in the first place. She told Ethan, during one of their long walks through the neighborhood where she had grown up, that she never wanted to become someone who forgot what it felt like to be overlooked, because the moment she forgot that feeling, she would lose whatever it was that made her able to see people the rest of the world walked past without a second glance. Ethan, listening to her, found himself falling more deeply in love with the very qualities his old life had trained him to distrust: the plainness, the refusal of excess, the stubborn insistence on staying rooted to the ground, even as the world around her tried to lift her into the clouds. Their relationship grew slowly, without the fanfare that might have surrounded a man of Ethan's position, both of them wary of turning something real into a spectacle. They spent evenings at Samuel's small apartment, the one Ethan had finally convinced his father to accept once Samuel felt ready to leave the shelter community behind, sharing simple meals and simpler conversation, and Samuel would watch the two of them together with an expression that mixed grief for the years he had lost with a gratitude so large it sometimes left him unable to speak. He told Maya once, quietly, while Ethan was in the kitchen, that from the very first morning she knelt beside him with warm bread and no expectation of anything in return he had known, in some instinct too old and too tired to argue with, that she was exactly the kind of person capable of bringing his broken family back together, though he could never have imagined, at the time, just how completely she would. A year passed with the kind of quiet steadiness that neither Ethan nor Samuel had experienced in decades. Samuel returned, at the board's unanimous invitation, to a position within Carter Foods, not as an executive with authority over daily operations, but as an honorary advisor whose presence in meetings served less as a functional role and more as a living reminder of the values the company had nearly lost sight of. He offered guidance when asked, and silence when it was not, content, simply to watch his son lead an institution he had helped build from the ground up, no longer haunted by the fear that his presence might somehow diminish what Ethan had accomplished in his absence. Ethan himself had changed in ways both subtle and profound, softer in meetings that had once been defined by his coldness, quicker to listen, quicker to forgive, willing now to talk about his father openly, even proudly, in interviews he had once dreaded. The bread and table fund expanded faster than anyone at the company had anticipated, opening its first permanent shelter within 8 months and partnering with a dozen bakeries across the city, including, at Maya's insistence, the small shop where she still worked part-time on weekends. Maya became something of a quiet fixture in local news, not because she sought attention, but because her story, once it became known, resonated with a public tired of hearing only about the powerful and hungry. Instead, to hear about the overlooked and the generous. She handled the attention the same way she had always handled everything, with a steadiness that refused to let praise inflate her sense of herself, insisting always that the story was never really about her, but about a man who had shown her that a moment of kindness could ripple outward in ways no one could ever fully predict. It was at the company's annual celebration, held that year in the very lobby, where Maya had once been waved toward a service elevator without a second glance, that Ethan chose to make the gesture he had been quietly planning for months. The lobby had been transformed for the evening. Warm light, replacing the usual cold fluorescence, employees and community members mingling together in a way the building had never quite allowed before. And when Ethan took the small stage set up near the entrance, ostensibly to thank the staff for another successful year, he instead turned the conversation, with visible nervousness that surprised everyone who thought they knew him, toward a story about bread and cold mornings, and a woman who had never once asked for anything in return. He called Maya up in front of the entire gathering, his voice unsteady in a way that made the room fall completely silent, and he told them all, without embellishment, the true story of how his father had come back into his life, because a delivery driver had chosen kindness over convenience on a morning cold enough to freeze the breath in her lungs. Maya stood beside him, stunned and blushing, unprepared for the moment, even though she had, on some level, sensed for weeks that something was building between them beyond the ordinary rhythms of their relationship. And then Ethan, in front of employees and board members, and a father whose eyes were already brimming with tears, knelt down and asked her, simply and without pretense, to marry him, to build with him the kind of family that neither of them had fully believed they deserved until the other one arrived. Samuel stepped forward before Maya had even finished saying yes, his hands trembling as he produced a small velvet box he had carried, unbeknownst to either of them, for weeks, in anticipation of exactly this moment. Inside was a ring that had belonged to his own mother, passed down through generations of the Carter family, a ring he had nearly sold during his hardest years on the street, but had chosen instead to keep, some stubborn hope, refusing to let it go, even when hope for almost everything else had grown thin. He placed it gently in Maya's hand and told her, his voice thick with emotion, that from the very morning she knelt beside him with warm bread and asked nothing in return, he had known, with a certainty he could not explain, that she was the one capable of leading his broken family back toward wholeness, though even he had not imagined it would happen in quite this way. The room erupted into applause, employees and strangers alike moved to tears by a moment that felt, in that gleaming lobby built for commerce and ambition, unexpectedly and entirely human. Victoria's name was mentioned by no one that evening. Her absence from the story, a quiet testament to how thoroughly truth and kindness had displaced the manipulation she had spent 20 years constructing. Somewhere in the crowd, employees who had once looked past Maya, without a second glance, now watched her with open admiration, understanding for the first time that the woman who had delivered their morning pastries had also, in her own quiet way, delivered their company back to itself. Later that evening, after the applause had faded and the crowd had thinned, Ethan and Maya walked out together into the cool night air, her hand held firmly in his, both of them still absorbing the weight of everything that had just happened. They did not head immediately toward the car waiting to take them home. Instead, without either of them suggesting it aloud, They found themselves walking the familiar few blocks toward the old train station on Ninth Street, toward the same brick wall where Samuel had once sat with nothing but a worn Bible and a patience that had outlasted 20 years of silence. The station looked the same as it always had, boarded and forgotten by most of the city that rushed past it every day, indifferent to the histories it quietly held. Maya knelt down at the familiar spot, and Ethan knelt beside her, and together they set down a single loaf of warm bread on the cold pavement, a small, unremarkable gesture that neither of them needed to explain to the other. It was not for anyone in particular now, not the way it had been that first morning, but it felt necessary all the same, a quiet acknowledgement of the place where an ordinary act of kindness had first begun quietly rewriting the future of three people who had no idea, on that cold gray morning, just how far its warmth would travel. Above them, the tower, where Ethan now led a company transformed by everything that had happened, rose into the night sky, its windows lit like 1,000 small fires, and somewhere among them, in an apartment not far away, Samuel Carter sat by his own window with a cup of tea, watching the same sky, finally, after 20 long years, at peace. The city moved on around them the way cities always do, indifferent and endless. Buses rumbling past, distant sirens rising and fading, strangers hurrying home beneath umbrellas they had forgotten to close, even though the rain had stopped an hour earlier. None of them noticed the couple kneeling quietly beside an abandoned train station, or the single loaf of bread left waiting on the pavement like an offering, or the invisible threads connecting that small gesture to a company, a family, and three lives entirely remade. But Maya noticed, and Ethan noticed, and somewhere across the city, so did Samuel, and for the three of them, that was enough. Kindness, it turned out, had never needed an audience to matter. It had only ever needed one small act, offered freely, on one cold morning, by someone who believed, without ever needing proof, that it would eventually find its way home.